Well, thank you so much, Charles, for agreeing to share your story and joining me. So I guess to begin, just introduce yourself. Tell us a bit about yourself.
Well, I'm 44. I'm from County Meath, but I was born in Dublin in Rotunda. I say that just a little thing because everyone thinks I'm English, right? When I'm Irish, and I was born in Dublin, you know.
Mm,
So yeah, I was educated. My family had been based, father's family was residing in Ringston, Summerhill, and that's an old big estate of its time in Meath. They've been there since about the 1850s. I was sent away to boarding school from 1986 for about 10 years, English. And that really kind of fuels my, my Anglo-Irish identity, and B, my otherness and not fitting inness,
mm,
Uh, which I only realized when I was 40, that actually it was such a big compulsion to get out of Ireland all the time.
mm,
Um,
mm,
so, so yeah, and as a net effect of not only seeing my parents over 120 months over in 10 years, was only seeing them for 50 months of that 120. Less than
mm, mm,
50% of that of the time I would actually spend with my parents. Most of the
mm,
time I was in a kind of a boarding school education kind of system run by other people.
mm.
Um,
And so then, aside from the time you spent in boarding school, then when did you become an immigrant and where did you go?
Well, uh, I kind of, well, at first I left when I was 8, of course. I came back, and I'm very conscious that I was my parents' made choices to send me away because I had to choose to come back to be into university. So it isn't always about when choosing to go away. So when you choose to come back, my first conscious choice was to come back to go to UCD and Ag Science. And so I went. Secondly, I went by choice. After I did UCD, and it was I started UCD in 1996. Was struggling with my sexuality in around 97 to 99, and headed off to Sydney as soon as I can get out of being gay within the horse racing circles, which is quite a closed loop, into off to Sydney to find myself. Kind of, I think Chris Folk and Derek Jarman were very much, he passed away around the late 90s, were very much influences of that. But Queer as Folk was Sydney was my kind of Queer as Folk-ish
Mm,
kind of escape and coming of age piece.
mhm,
So it was my sexuality that sort of, I didn't feel comfortable within my family's culture.
mm,
Um, and so I ended up heading off into just in time for Sydney and the Olympics for my gap year. And I ended up staying in Sydney and having a relationship with a guy for about 10 months, basically.
mm,
And then I returned to Ireland. Went back into Smurfit Business School 2001, just in time for 9/11 and all that. That puts into context. And then halfway through that year, I fell back in love with them, and I wanted to relocate back to Australia. So I left for Australia for a second time in
mm,
summer 2002. Ended up not getting into my university on the first semester. I had to wait 8 months on shore and I ended up having a good time, not really working, burning through reserves in Sydney, just with my then boyfriend.
mm,
We're it was a very formative time. It was very much living on the street level, kind of in the bars of Sydney. Being involved in, the first year I was there in Australia, I was involved in the Mardi Gras parade. So I was in the parade, and I was gifted by people who were older. I was very young and kind of fresh in 2000 to go to at least the 3 to 4 of the big parties with no ticket, with gifted tickets and all that. So
mm,
obviously charmed the pants off people. Had some very memorable moments over in Sydney the first year. And the second year, I was there for 8 months, and then I moved down and relocated to Melbourne in February 2003 and started my master's in internet computing at RMIT, where I ran until end of March 2002 to end of December 2004. And I came back in the height of the summer, getting stuck cold in a fire in Charles de Gaulle on the way back, to land in the middle of the winter. And shock horror is like horrendous,
mm,
relocation. So And then, I was here in Ireland for 4 more years. Thank you. There's a time I spent for my parents. And then, of course, I started to smell a rat around financial crisis, but also I was saying itchy feet because I moved out of Dublin. I was in country outside Ireland, and I was living on my own, and I wasn't liking it. So and then some funds came my way, and I decided to up and leave and go to the Netherlands. And I found that was a much more easier. And I think this kind of restlessness comes from the public school, back and forth every so often, changing every 5 years, thing. So there was a restlessness in myself that kind of pushed me out. And also drove me, and I kind of pulled me along. And I had chosen Amsterdam because I've been over 20 days in visits, and I was really loving it. And really, the smallest little trigger was the price of a pint of bottle of beer was €3.50 compared to €5 in Dublin at the time. So the price of beer, socialization in 2008 was expensive compared to rest of Europe. And also, there was a lot more sexual expression, and I had really I broke my heart over a few people. And I closed my heart, and I was starting to want to reimagine myself. So I got into the hypersexualized kind of approach to leather and fetish and all that, but I was hiding it in Ireland. Because I was hiding it in Ireland, I felt also repressed, right? I was hiding my leathers in my morning suit. So I found the Netherlands was very ready to move over and to chase sexual expression and to escape living in rural Ireland, and also, just to try my luck of living and working in Europe. I think that's always part of that kind of being other, but also being expat, that sort of like living on the edge, and sort of you're never quite. It's like and you're going for the other thing I always said, it was creating a carte blanche. I went to Australia, I created a carte blanche, I created my own life. I went to Netherlands, I created my own life, and Netherlands was incredibly successful. I ended up staying there up to nearly from almost 8 years, just shy of 8 years, and I came back. Left in 2008 and came back in 2016.
And when you were abroad, did Irish identity figure much into your life, or Anglo-Irish identity, indeed?
In some ways, sometimes in the negative space of not being different or other in Ireland. I remember trying to go have a relationship or have catch up with people after a night with a guy. I said, "Oh, he's a West Brit," and I'm just feeling like I'm trying to meet you guys. I can't do this here, So in the negative space, I didn't have to deal with that yet. Of course, the Dutch said, "Oh, you're English. No, you're Irish. Oh, sorry." The Dutch, the Continental's approach was, "Oh, we apologize for misidentifying you." Where here was, "Oh, we'll tag you and label you and put you in a box." So very much that was a factor. But at the same time, I love the fact that when I was abroad, particularly in the Netherlands, and less, Australians, there's always a lot of second generation, third generation Irish anyway. So, but the less so in the Netherlands. But there were a few Irish, but I kind of stayed away from the expat communities per se, and I went native or local. Got to know people who live and breathe or born on that country. So I tend to have a tendency to kind of integrate pretty quickly, So, and I love the fact that by the time I was in the last couple of years in Amsterdam, there would be a Dutchman, German, Austrian, Frenchman, and an Irishman walking down the street. Cue a joke for walking into a bar, So I love that sort of cosmopolitan approach, So that was kind of one of the reasons why my Irish identity was sort of there, but I had much stronger identities like being Mr. Leather of Obama, Dutch Mr. Leather title holder at one point. So a very strong quasi-public sexual identity that sort of happened when I was in the Netherlands. And just sort of being very visible, kind of, out there, at work, not as much, but still visible and known, so I would be pretty known. But also, here's the thing about it also, I was working for Europol, and I joined there very much of a strong Irish community at work, through the work as well. So, because there was the Irish Garda people and then the Irish nationals who were working in the European agencies. So there would be those as well, and you'd be familiar with those. So, but I kind of kept my gay identity mostly separate from my work identity. I literally worked in the Netherlands, in The Hague, and that was my work identity with the Irish, and then I had a separate kind of life up in Amsterdam.
Right. That's interesting, and in a way, going abroad kind of allowed you to break free of different kind of entanglements of how Irish people perceived Anglo-Irish identity. Yeah.
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 I kept for a long time. I kept I started to come out more about which kind of house I grew up in and all that. For a long time in my 20s, I did not disclose, and it was sort of an unwritten rule in the family, not disclose what kind of house and background did I come from, unless people who knew us had come to the house, right? There was sort of an unwritten rule in family. Don't talk about Rainston unless you're in the Rainston Club or the people who visit Rainston, So, and I didn't want to be seen separate. So, yeah. But then I started to kind of show my house, my family, where I came from, off to people in the Netherlands or who were German or Austrian. It didn't matter as much to them.
Yeah. It's interesting to hear you talk about these questions of Anglo-Irish identity, because in many ways, some Irish people might think they're kind of in the 50s, or, that it doesn't live on, that kind of whole culture and that whole, those questions of the big house, so to speak. It's just interesting.
I never called it a big house. It was just my home,
Yeah.
It's weird when I hear it call people, you come from a big house. It's like, there's a whole backstory of a rabbit hole behind that one expression, the big house, And yet, at the same time, I do look at the histories and the documents and the old accounts, and it was the hub of the community back in the 1850s and prior to the famine,
So, what made you decide to return to Ireland and be in Ireland now?
Well, I unfortunately, when I left for the first time in 2008, I lost my father from a tragic accident, and it's in the media. So he was first page in the Irish Times. He was killed through a farming accident, a tree felling accident, right, branch, just tragic accident. And then my mom had to take over the big estate, sans her husband, and in the biggest crisis of what we've had in recent times, And my mom, she'd already been in remission by that stage for about 5 years, I think, of cancer. She went on to another 5 years, and then she suddenly got a very aggressive form of cancer back. She was dealing with a legal case, it was called stress. And suddenly we had basically 14 months of her. And then, but within a year of my dad dying, I had ended up in Europol on a 2+3 year contract. And the time my mom had died, she died in the last year, within the last 18 months of my last 2 years of my contract. And then Europol, at the time, they don't do it anymore, but they had a thing where you do sing for yourself a third contract, but only less than 1% of people actually get it. So it was quite a brutal exit procedure. It was an very old system. And so eventually I lost my contract, but I was very successful to move on from the public sector into the private sector. And I did. I jumped into consultancy. However, that was a bit of a firefight. And it did, the company didn't keep its contract with its partner, and B, they had let us all go within, I don't know, for 14 months of me starting with them. And I'd fallen sick 8 months into that, 6 months into that contract, and they had to get rid of me 8 months later. And I ended up running out of road, mentally, physically, and professional opportunity-wise, multiple burnouts and all that. So I came home. And also I wanted to come home because I had been away when my mom had died, and I'd been away from my father had died. And I hadn't done that sort of, as you know, the Irish culture, of that sort of grieving process within the friends and family and the community. And I had a completely dislocated experience of grief from my parents. So part of me was sort of healing a little bit. And so, and it didn't, it all rushed back when I landed on shore in August 2016. But and also we had outstanding legal challenge issues as well. So I wanted to be on shore and not be so separated from it all, right? And I ran out of road and opportunity, health and capability to find work in the Netherlands. And money was a challenge, or could have been a challenge. So I needed to come home.
And Did you find yourself, how had Ireland changed? Was it a more welcoming place this most recent time that you came home? Had it changed or had it not changed?
It had changed a lot. The first impression I got was the different number of languages I'd heard on the street, up and down. Secondly, was the range of foodstuffs and eateries were available. That was the kind of the visceral changes I saw. Right, the ones that are much more wasn't purely because it's Ireland, but I think it is very much a characteristic of Ireland. That Ireland, on returning here, and other people would say this as well, isn't kind to those who want to reintegrate. You can see the Irish Times abroad column, you probably read a lot about a lot of people who come here and then headed back within 6 months or 12 months, So Ireland does not make it easy to reintegrate, particularly along with the habitual residence condition. For instance, when I had moved over to the Netherlands, all I did was I walked to one desk, filled in a few forms, and I was registered. I didn't have to fill out a 30-page of proof that I was a returning or inbound expat, to the country. And it was all then processed into the government system and then easily done within 4 weeks. Here, it was, part of those, you have to go from different desk aid, local authority to wherever, nothing's integrated. It was all a thing. And I found that overwhelming, right? And that feeds into my narrative of why I ended up hospital and so sick 10 months later. Secondly, is I found that because of work and networking and not being doing what I would at the time blame not being part of the after hours pub circuit in Dublin and living in the countryside and not being really connected to people for the last 8 years. I hadn't been in people's lives. And that's the other aspect, which is the personal relationship piece. And I have found that very challenging because I really was struggling to apply through all the jobs and all the things. And I had a very highbrow skills from Europol and security, and skill sets that weren't really were too early in that time in 2015, 16, but they were in demand eventually. But I wasn't getting any look in because I had no referral negatives. And I also suspect that a lot of Irish companies and employers mistrust foreign experience, whether it's, regardless of where it comes from, even with the European Commission level experience, because there's nothing local reference that they refer to. And so those are kind of things that I found that were barriers to me being back. And the also thing is a lot of people, I was in my late 30s, early 40s, a lot of people had married, settled down, and I had majority of my friends here not gay. And I didn't have a gay mafia-esque group of people I was close to, but they've been mostly focused on in Amsterdam. And most people who were focused on being 40-something with children, early young children, and found that social integration piece was very hard. Because everyone's busy, in the late 30s, early 40s,
And then, Charles, I guess I wanted to ask as well, to kind of as a final note. So we were put in touch through the Living Project, and I guess if we just speak about how you came to be connected with it and what we need to do in Ireland in terms of challenging HIV stigma.
Yeah, well, I've got several things. How I came to the Living Project is I actually was reading a very fascinating article I sent it on to, and there's a paper behind it about how stigma and what's wrong attention on moral panic, how HIV is then treated by the Irish media, right? And I was reading that from NAM, or the World AIDS Map newsletter I get on the regular basis on HIV. So that's how I keep track of all things medically and also social politically around HIV. Is that a very good, from the Terence Higgins Trust, I think, funded, but it's a NAM newsletter. And they had a very good article, and I'll send it to you later, about the attitudes of journalists or news organizations towards and how voices are represented. And it was done out of a paper from Galway on social health or social political health matters. And it was and it got me kind of motivated a little, I must fight stigma, because not only do I have HIV stigma, I dealt with leather stigma around fetish stuff, stigma being gay, and also and forms of stigma around being Irish at boarding school, and also forms of stigma around being dyslexic or learning neural diversity. So there's almost 5 levels of tiers of stigma with me, that I have to deal with in forms of, and also mental health, So stigma is a topic that I know I'm familiar in by experiential things. So whatever the kind of flavor of stigma, there's a lot to be done with it. But the trouble is, most people don't want to be changed and educated otherwise until they hit stigma or experience it in their world, and then they become change your tune. But and that's if they're not ashamed by it, you know. But so that's the kind of the dynamics that led me into reaching out. And actually, I wouldn't normally apply to things like living exhibition, but I did. I sort of was fired up at the time. So, and I wanted, like, one way or the other, to tell my story, because aside from the HIV piece and your intent here, this is the current container we're in. I'm just coming out of a whole of complex PTSD and put a trauma after my breakdown. And, you know, one of the things one of the kind of drivers for this is instead of what's wrong narrative, I'm trying to rewrite my narrative to what's right. And that is actually about practice and feedback. This is practice of rewriting new stories and a new way of describing what's happened to me in the past, but also do it in a safe way that doesn't trigger me. And this is not triggering at all. I actually really enjoyed it. I'd never written down my story. And that's your questions gave me the framework. So I wanted to tell my story. And then also I'm starting to experiment pushing myself from a kind of freezy business of frozen and locked to opening up and kind of breezy, you know, being more breezy and open and exposing myself a little bit, you know. And so this was a safe way to do it in a context I was familiar with, HIV. And I was willing, and I've been in a kind of quasi-public figure role before with the whole Mr. stuff. And so I was sort of pulling on certain familiar strings, but wasn't sure what was going to come out of it. So like today, here we are. This isn't, I was not intending it, but it's just these experiments, and I'm trying to experiment with where I'm at. And so in terms of what we can do around stigma, firstly is media representation. And that is a big thing. That media article, I'm not the expert in this, but I found it very interesting to stand up for the underdog, you know, ish. And secondly, yeah, good informed information. You know, for instance, the Dutch, they do for famous people said, I'm positive, or I'm not positive, but I support people positive. Bus stop campaigns, right? So they get public people to support things, and they have these sort of information campaigns at bus stop level, not about prevention or what could be medically wrong, but more about the same changing hearts and minds. So if you want to answer that, there should be more heart to mind and endorsement by public figures, well-known, saying it's okay, you know, to get PrEP. It's okay to get PrEP. It's okay to this. Not that it's focused on into the community, because sometimes it's into the community, it's navel gazing. What we need to do is recruit allies from outside in, you know, to change that. And you need that by, you know, good examples of people who are out and out, but not to kind of like the Colton of the world and have a documentary and this is great. But you have people who are actually like rugby players, your man from Wales, I can't remember, Ian, and all that. They're very good to do that, but they also get hounded by the media for public gossip and salaciousness. So how do you find strike a balance between that desire for consumption versus desire and pointing to the other versus education and information and endorsement by the same people, or people who are not gay who say, this is me too, you know?
Yeah, no, that is fascinating, Charles. And I guess we'll end it there on those very thoughtful prompts as well, for people to kind of think